Good evening, everyone. I'm Joel Erickson. I direct the Fulbright program in Russia, and welcome to this evening's event, which is dedicated to discussing the Fulbright International Arctic Seminar, which took place March 19th and 20th on Zoom, a Zoom call like this. We were at the Fulbright program, we were inspired by the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program worldwide. Program involves 160 different countries. And we were looking for ways to celebrate that. And so we decided to do this forum, international forum on things related to the Arctic. We believe an area of interest that has become really a profound one for the global community. The Fulbright program is dedicated to mutual understanding. And we think that mutual understanding leads to building on mutual interests. And one area of great co-interest for both the United States and Russia is the Arctic region, where we think there's great shared interest to battle climate change and to deal with the effects of climate. When we gathered the scholars together for the Zoom seminar, which took place in March, we had really wonderful presentations, and many countries were involved, including India, Great Britain, and others, the United States, of course, and Russia. A lot of what they talked about regarded measurement, maybe looking from space at the effect of climate change on tides, or looking at soil, looking at the effects that are caused by melting of the permafrost, or the emission of methane. But maybe what really crystallized our seminar was looking at the human effects of climate change. How are local communities affected? And so we're hoping that today's summary event, the interview that will take place will really help us focus on that key aspect. How are humans affected by climate change, and maybe what they can do to battle its effects? I'd like to introduce my colleague now, Ksenia Shomnikova, who will introduce our guest speakers and the interview that will take place. Ksenia Shomnikova is the alumni coordinator for the Fulbright program in Russia. Ksenia.
Thank you, Joel. Welcome everyone to this event. Thank you so much for attending. I coordinate Fulbright alumni and also took part in organizing the seminar, which as well had several alumni among the organizing committee. So this is one of those events that we hope to continue doing in the future with the help of our alums. And today, we have two speakers with us, two experts on the Arctic. One of them is Alexei Maslakov, who presented at one of the panels of our seminar, the Social Development and Human Health in the Arctic Environment panel. Alexei Maslakov works at the Lomonosov Moscow State University. He's a researcher at the Laboratory of Geoecology of the North. And he presented a report about how permafrost degradation affects the Bering Strait coastal communities. And very interested in his research is Sьюзан Крейт, our second speaker today. Sьюзан is a selected Fulbright Arctic Initiative scholar who we're hoping to see on the Russian soil soon. And she is also professor of anthropology in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. So we're hoping that Sьюзан and Alexei will engage in a discussion that will benefit both the listeners and themselves. And I think that we could start with Alexei presenting his research, kind of like summarizing what he presented at the seminar and demonstrating it to the listeners so that they know what's going on. And then Sьюзан, you're welcome to drop your questions. And Alexei, you can also maybe have some questions and answers with Sьюзан going on. So Alexei, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Let me briefly show my presentation and highlight the main points of my research. Is it visible? Yeah. Just a moment. Let me. Okay. Some slides will be missed, and we will skip them. And just a few main points. I'm focused on studying on permafrost dynamics in the Bering Strait region, mostly, of course, in Chukotka, and based on some literature review in Alaskan side. The interesting item of this region is that these communities are located in the same environmental conditions, and actually they have the people who live there, they have relatives in from the other side of the strait, Bering Strait, but due to some political and economical features, these communities have been developing in different way. So if for Alaskan communities, we had an example of development during capitalism, we had the Russian communities which been developing during Soviet time, and they have such features in economic development. I'll tell you about them a little later. So we now see the climate is changing, and it is changing in the Arctic much more intensive than all over the world, in 2 times or even in 3 times faster. So temperature increase is very drastic in the Arctic. And at the same time, we see that sea ice cover is also shrinking. That affects coastal communities of Alaska and Chukotka. And the first item I would like to show you is the problem of ice cellars. Ice cellars are chambers or tunnels dug in permafrost in natural conditions, and they are aimed to preserve food for store them all over the year for food supply for local communities and for fox farms for Chukotka. And the main feature for Chukotka is that these ice cellars are really great. You see the ice cellar in Lorena community. This is tunnel of 160 meters long. This is really huge facility constructed during Soviet era for communal use. And the whole community, the whole village use this storage for food storage. Yeah. And unfortunately, due to some reasons, climate change and human impact, these ice cellars have been collapsing. And by this time, there are only 2 ice cellars still remain in Chukotka. This is ice cellar in Lorena community and ice cellar in Nurmina on the north of Chukotka. All the other ice cellars in different villages have been collapsed. And the main object of my study is ice cellar of Lorena. You can see the scheme of this community. This is ice cellar. This is fox farm for the community, and how this ice cellar looks like. You can see the chambers in the below part of the slide, and you can see this is a really great facility. And due to climate warming, permafrost degrades, and permafrost degradation, of course, affects these underground facilities. You see the collapsing, the flooding, the examples of flooding, and one important feature that allows us to state that the problem is becoming more acute in recent years is that the meat is covered with mold. It means the temperature within ice cellars turns to positive, higher than 0 degrees Celsius. And in this way, it becomes thawing and expected to collapse very soon. Another issue for communities in Bering Strait is that all these communities are located on sea coast and they're experiencing wave action. So due to recent climate change, we noticed that ice cover is shrinking in time, in space. And due to this process, the coastal erosion intensifies in recent years. You can see here the examples of coastal erosion consequences for communities of Chukotka, which were found by my expeditions in different years. The same situation is in Alaskan side. And on the map, you can see the communities which are experiencing coastal erosion and they lose their territory. Unfortunately, this trend is not positive, and coastal erosion rates will be increasing in the future. And for learning communities, this is key site for studies of coastal erosion. You can see the satellite image of this. And as you can see here, the coastal bluff is pretty close to engineering facilities. And in some years, these buildings will be destructed. So the community requires some relocation measures for these facilities. And according to my studies of the dynamics of coastal erosion in Lorena, we have noticed that the recent years, maybe recent 10 years, the coastal erosion intensify and is more intensive than in previous decades that allow us to state that the changes in the Arctic are more drastic than we expected. And if previously we had coastal erosion rates maybe 10, maybe 20 centimeters per year, as on this part of the graph, you can see that recently coastal erosion rate has increased in an almost order, 4 meters per year. And here are some examples on how coast changing. You see that on the picture of 2001, the coast is covered with grass, with many boats on this very high and wide beach. And only in 10 years, there's the same place. You can see the beach is almost gone. You can see the coastal bluff is almost bare, with no cover of vegetation. And in 5 years, you can see some facilities have already appeared on the edge of this bluff. In the several years, these facilities will be destructed. Another problem is thawing of permafrost. Since the summer becomes much more warmer than in previous decades, the soil thaws deeper. And since it thaws deeper, the ice in permafrost melts and goes to the ocean. And the surface cover is decreasing. This is the dynamics of coastal, of active layer dynamics, and you can see that the soil thaw depth is increasing for the last 20 years. And what is the consequences of this process? You can see the consequences on these pictures. This is landslides, thermokarst, thermal erosion. These exogenous processes are intensified due to deep thaw of soil. And of course, this is a big problem for local people because ravines and gullies, they are not good for transportation. People have to find bypass and to find the way how to go through them. And of course, if the infrastructure is located within these gullies, you can see on this picture, this is also a big problem for these communities, because reparation measures are very, very costly for local budgets, and this is a really big problem. Due to permafrost thaw, the lowering of soil surface is detected, and on this picture you can see the stick which was located into the permafrost in order to measure temperature on different depths, and in 5 years it was exposed to the air and exposed from permafrost due to thaw subsidence, the lowering of soil temperature. And according to our forecast, this trends will be saved, and soil thawing will be even more intensive in the future. And of course, these communities are all located on permafrost, and the buildings have to interact in permafrost somehow. Unfortunately, due to low quality measures on keeping permafrost solid, keeping permafrost stable, we see that exogenous processes are also activated within the communities. For example, this is a map of active layer thickness within learning community, and you can see that within these communities, the average depth of soil thaw is about 2 meters, while in the neighboring parts out of this communities, we can see that soil thaw depth is much less. And of course, buildings which are constructed on permafrost, they have heat impact there. They produce heat due to heat systems, and it goes to permafrost and forms telex. Telex are thaw areas which don't freeze during winter, and these areas are thawed all over the year. Of course, such processes lead to deformations of buildings, like on this picture, and of course they're demolishing. And the Chukotka is actually one of the few regions in Arctic Russia where the problem of living space is very acute, because due to migration of people to moderate latitudes, actually the towns are abandoned in Russian Arctic. But in Chukotka, there's a different problem. The problem is that people don't go somewhere, they stay on their place, and the buildings are destructing and people don't have a place to live. This is a really big problem for local budgets, because constructing of new buildings is very expensive. So we also communicated to local people and interviewed them through the questionnaires. And you can see this result here, that people also notice that the climate is changing, that the 1,000 species of animals comes to their latitudes, invasive species of animals and plants. They see that the tundra is becoming more, the tundra is blooming, the more bushes occurs in tundra. This is a big problem for reindeer herding. They also notice that gully erosion and coastal erosion and waterlogging, and etc., etc., etc. So our measurements are corresponds to local opinion. So here are some brief slides on the conclusions. And this is the final slide. Thank you for attention for my brief introduction. And this place, this picture shows the local people who are gathering berries, and we just met them and sitting, talking to them about climate change and permafrost change. Thank you for attention. I hope I didn't exceed my time. Just wait a second. Stop the demonstration. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexei. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think, Susan, you can now address Alexei with all the questions that you have been wanting to ask him. And put your mic on, it's off. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today. I viewed Alexei's presentation during the seminar and with a lot of excitement. Part of it is because he's such a young researcher, and it excites me because I'm hoping that there'll be many more like him. So my first question, Alexei, is how did you get interested in this, and who was your main mentor, and who continues to be that main mentor?
Yeah, actually, this program has my studies started from actually circumpolar active layer monitoring program, which is NSF funded program where all over the permafrost areas in different parts of the world, people establish monitoring sites and measure the thickness of soil which thaws every summer. And I was just visiting the place and measuring the soil thaw during every summer and just getting that data and collecting it, analyzing it, and doing some studies. But since I've been living in local communities this time every summer, I was noticing that that buildings experiencing the troubles with deformations. And I've been talking to people, they also told me that they experiencing problems moving in tundra, and the problems of saving their coastal facilities. And after that, I thought that, well, the permafrost thaws, and somehow it must affect local communities. And I decided to study this. And my studies, well, they turned in that what you saw on this presentation. So it was just a natural program without any human participation, without any social, economic dimensions, just dynamics of active layer thickness.
So, I mean, just considering how siloed academia is, and you're in a geography department, I think, or a cryosphere department, how did your colleagues think about it when you started going into looking at these social dimensions?
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic, and this is interdisciplinary topic. That's why I'm not alone working there. Of course, I try to attract my colleagues from human geography to describe, to study deeper these problems, because what I can do, I can measure permafrost. I can ask people, but I don't know much about approach which social people, social studies and anthropology studies use for their investigations. So the people, my colleagues, are very interested in these studies. But of course, it could be also good to me to attract some more anthropologists in my study.
That's a great idea. I bet there are some at your institution, right?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting perspective.
So many people will look at this situation and just say, well, those people need to move. They just need to move to a different place. What would you say to them in response?
Yeah, when I was talking to the representatives of local governments in Chukotka, of course, they say that they are thinking on relocation of communities. But when I talk to local people who live in there, of course, they refuse to move somewhere. They have been living there for hundreds of years, because Lorena community, which was known since 16th century, so 5 centuries of people living there, and people whose ancestors been buried there. So this is their land. They have no space to go, because the community is located on a very convenient place, because they are very convenient to hunt. They are very convenient for gathering. And if government decides to relocate them to some other place, well, the problem will be with human well-being. For example, the community of Lavrentia is located 40 kilometers near Lorena site. And this is the only community which was constructed during Soviet era in 1929. And it was the place where local government decided to choose for this community. This is southern part of the Gulf, and not very convenient to for local people to hunt. They have to go for several kilometers in order to get to place where to hunt on whales, on fishing. And of course, this area is lack of mushrooms and berries. So people who live in Lavrentia, they suffer from this. And people who live in different communities, so they say, well, guys, you are living in that place. It's not very good. Why do you still be living there? Come to us. Of course, relocation question is very acute, because local people, they don't want to be moved somewhere.
Yeah, I can identify a lot with this. It's a similar situation where I do my research, and that's why I'm interested in asking you these questions. And also where I do my research in the Saha Republic, in the rural settlements, young people are leaving the settlements to go to the urban centers. And I'm wondering, to what extent is that occurring in these coastal communities in Chukotka? Are young people wanting to stay? Are they going? And if they're going, what's going to happen eventually, right? This is an important question. I wonder if you've thought of this and what you think about that.
Well, this is very common situation when young people from villages are going to the larger cities in order to get better opportunities for their development. But in Chukotka, I saw quite different situation, because they have very strong capacity building. When the older generation tries to show how wonderful life to live there, how good to live close to the nature, and so to be traditional in their view. And young people, they have many reasons to stay, because although they have no very good jobs, not very high salary, but actually they are located in their own places. This is their land, and they feel that. And of course, they may hunt whales, they may hunt walruses, and they won't starve. This is the minimal that they satisfy. And so if they all fed up, so it's pretty good for them. And I believe that Chukotka communities will be growing in the future, because they have such a big rate of birth. They have 6 to 8 children in every family. And actually, in Russian villages, it's a very big problem that houses are being abandoned. And this is not the same situation for Chukotka, because people are building new facilities, new houses for their children, for their grandchildren. And so this region must be considered from the point of view of economic development, I think, because these people don't go anywhere.
Okay, so they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to continue living there. You, as a scientist, as an advocate, as somebody obviously who has huge empathy for their situation, how can you advise them in terms of how they can stay there forever? What can they do?
Well, I am not a economist. I'm not a social geographer, but I can assume that. So now they have a program of state support. If a local community establish their local enterprise on hunting on whales and hunting on different marine mammals, they register and they can apply for grants from the government. The government subsidies their costs and gives them money in order to maintain local lifestyle, in order to maintain their boats, their beacons, their supplies for food. And I think that this problem is quite positive, because for Alaska, we have different examples. As you know, Alaska is rich of oil and different resources. And people get this money just for nothing. They just get it as it is. They don't have to apply for some grant, and this makes them more relaxed. Since they're relaxed, they don't need to do something for this. And in Chukotka, this is quite a different situation. I think that grant support from the government is the best solution now, because, well, Chukotka is not rich for mineral resources. There are nothing in there. And it's very expensive to put some industry there, some plants there. And so these people just can sustain their life with traditional ways.
So is this the government of Chukotka, not the Russian Federation?
The government of Chukotka also supported by Russian government.
Okay, but the program you're speaking of is directly from the Chukotka government.
This is budget funds. So
okay.
Budget from the whole Russia.
Yeah. So what about, what can they do in terms of the thermokarst and the slumping and everything? Is there any way to help them make that process slow down? do anything to be able to physically stay where they are without relocating? I know the coastal erosion is a huge problem.
I think that it is very important issue which must be considered on governmental level. They have to develop and apply the plan of mitigating of consequences, of negative consequences of climate change and adaptation to these changes. The big problem is that when the buildings were constructed in 1916, in 1970s, they were designed as for climate and permafrost conditions of that time. And when people did that, they expected that no any changes will happen. They expected that permafrost temperature will be, for example, -4. And they designed buildings for -4 temperature. They put piles in permafrost, and they thought that nothing happened. No temperature increase, no any environmental condition changed, but actually it changed. The temperature of permafrost has increased for 3 to 4 degrees Celsius for the last 40 years in different regions. And the piles which are in permafrost, they have a bearing capacity, the capacity to bear the loads. And since the permafrost becomes warmer, the bearing capacity decrease. It makes buildings vulnerable to climate change. And I think that if government would like to save these communities, they have to design buildings according to new conditions. Of course, they have to take measures on coastal protection because coastal erosion is very fast, for example, for learning community. And yeah, I think that the plan on mitigating on negative consequences must be developed and must be executed for every community.
Yeah, okay, so my last question is one about international cooperation. What kind of ideas do you think there are for, you mentioned in the seminar presentation something about learning together with the United States, because in Alaska, coastal communities are facing these same issues. So what kind of potential is there for international collaboration to work on these issues?
Well, I think that most of scientists, they consider the problems of Chukotka and problems of Alaska separately, but actually this is a single region. Many years ago, during prehistoric times, this area was a single land when the ocean level was much more lower. The environmental conditions being the same, and since now these conditions are still the same, and people living in different social conditions, in different economic conditions, but they meet the same environmental problems. And local governments try to decide these problems in different ways. And I think that this problem can be decided during meetings of governments from both sides. The delegations from Alaska must visit Chukotkan villages. Chukotka delegation must visit Alaskan villages. They have to share their experience and use best practices on how they have to, what should they do in order to mitigate these consequences. I think that international exchange and international collaboration must be developed. Unfortunately, although these areas have a difference only 80 kilometers in political ways, they are on the different poles, and due to political restrictions, the local people cannot move to their relatives, and they have no possibility to exchange. And I think that like a conference or a seminar must be organized for the stakeholders. This is also local people, local governments, local businessmen, and etc., etc. So this must be a multidisciplinary seminar in order to discuss this problem.
Well, we should continue to talk about that idea and see if we can make it happen, get some
Yeah.
funding from somewhere. That's all my questions.
Thank you for your questions. I was very pleased to have them.
Of course, I have a million more, but I won't take up the time.
Well,
Thank you,
I'll
Suzanne.
just interject now by saying thank you very much to both our speakers. And Susan, you're free to continue speaking, but I just wanted to say, I think Alexei almost gave us a great idea for moving forward. And
Yeah.
I think I want people to know that that's noted, and that the Fulbright program can react to that, and we'll look for a way to do so. But I just wanted to interject to say that.
Yeah, I think there's so much power in people-to-people exchanges. I mean, it sounds kind of old-fashioned, but it's old-fashioned because it's true, right? I mean, when people meet each other, and I guess it was probably, I remember my first trip to the Soviet Union was in 1987. That's when, the wall was beginning to fall, and these ideas of people-to-people exchanges, and it was true. I mean, we were meeting these people who beforehand we thought were our enemies. So I think, going and visiting other people and seeing their plight being pretty much the same as yours and sharing information is a powerful, powerful process.
I mean, same thing happened to me. I came a few years later, but 1989, coming to the Soviet Union for the first time, you discover so much in common, really. And, it's amazing that we're, as you said, they're poles apart, but only about 80 kilometers away from one another. And I think that through a variety of means, maybe including Zoom, we can figure out a way to connect people on both sides who are relatives of one another even. And I think that a lot, by sharing best practices and maybe by looking for other sorts of ways to introduce technology, maybe building technology. I know architects look a lot at these factors now, and maybe there's ways that the housing can be improved on the Chukotka side, and maybe the Alaskans could help in some way.
Yeah. Okay, so should I go ahead and share my slides?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So this is the title of my focus with the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, the third iteration of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. Knowing permafrost, I put quotes around it because a lot of the work I do as an anthropologist in the last decade or so has focused on knowledge systems. A lot of that comes from my own experience working, especially with the group I've worked with since 1991 in Northeastern Siberia, Saha. And I just want to give you a sense of, I did my master's research in 92. I did my doctorate in 99, 2000. And then I did a few projects after that. And around 2005, communities started asking me about why the winters weren't as cold, why the summers weren't as warm, why the seasons were coming at the wrong times. I knew from my own education and experience that these were qualifications of climate change. But as an anthropologist, I didn't start preaching climate change. I was curious and wanted to know more. So before we left the field that summer of 2005, we interviewed 30 elders because they had seen the most annual changes over their lifetimes to understand about the changes that these other people were speaking about. And 10 of those 30 elders mentioned that the bull of winter wasn't arriving anymore. So the bull of winter, I knew what the bull of winter was because I knew the cosmology and the mythology of Saha. It's a way they explain this 3-month period in winter of intense cold and dryness. It doesn't snow. They believe the bull arrives. And then, so it starts in early December. Around mid-February, as that cold starts to lift, one of the bull's horns falls off. A few weeks later, another horn falls off. A few weeks later, the head falls off and it starts to snow and spring has arrived. So as an anthropologist, when 10 of these 30 elders, unbeknownst to each other, mentioned that the bull of winter wasn't arriving, it struck me, we know a lot about the physical changes of climate change, but we don't know much about the cultural effects. So how does it affect a community who understands the changing of the seasons based upon this, for example, the bull of winter, and suddenly that explanation doesn't hold anymore? How does that affect people on the ground? Those were my questions, which led to, I came back from that research project and put together a proposal for a study that looked specifically at these changes that people were speaking of. We did focus groups and interviews, and based upon those qualitative methods, we found that these were the 9 main changes that the majority of people agreed with. You'll notice a lot of these were similar to what Alexei's communities were commenting on. We also understood, you see these men are filling out charts, we had female focus groups also. I asked them to write down first the changes they'd seen, what they thought each change was caused by, how that was affecting them and their families, and what they thought would be in 10 years if it continued that way. And most of the people that we worked with did not attribute these changes to climate change. They talked about the huge reservoir they built in the Soviet period and how that was affecting their local climate. They talked about, et cetera. So climate change was not on their radar. I was at the time collaborating with a permafrost scientist in Yakutsk, Alexander Fyodorov, and I mentioned to him this lack of regional information about the effects of climate change. He was doing research on permafrost change, research on climate change. And so we agreed to do what we called knowledge exchanges. So you see at the top of this slide, the images of these knowledge exchanges. We went into the communities. We first asked local people to get up and talk about the changes they've seen. This woman on the far left is talking about how new species of birds have come. She knows this because she tries to grow tomatoes in this extreme environment, and they're eating all her tomatoes. So she's very aware of these new species. In the center picture, you see Alexander Fyodorov actually presenting his research, also showing very familiar landscapes, as we saw in Alexei's presentation of the land slumping and falling and rising. And young people were there also learning. We got feedback after these knowledge exchanges. We did 4 in the regional centers and 4 in our research communities. Most people thought we should continue to do them in all the villages throughout the Vilui regions. And since we weren't able to do that, we decided to put together a handbook. And so for 3 summers, we went back and forth and wrote this community-based handbook based on this knowledge exchange. And we're able to distribute it thanks to our NSF funding. So in the interim period between 2014 and 2018, I did not go to do research. I got another funding opportunity to go back in 2018, and I was struck by the level at which people understood climate change and the effects. A lot of it had to do with the changes in the permafrost. You see in these 2 images here, the projections of the thawing of the permafrost. This is very concerning. And so as people were learning more about it, as people were going out, they know the land very well. They have a very intimate knowledge of their landscape, of their ecosystem. They have to in order to thrive there as human communities. And they were noticing the changes in the landscape, the falling and the rising of the landscape, et cetera. So in that short 4-year period, I noticed that the communities had increased greatly in their knowledge of climate change overall, but also permafrost change specifically. Alexander Fyodorov, continuing as I continue to collaborate with him, I've gained quite a great education about permafrost. Permafrost is not all the same. And it turns out that the specific permafrost, the permafrost that is under the Alas ecosystems, which are these ecosystems that Saha's Turkic ancestors inhabited in the 13 and 1400s when they first came from the south to settle in these areas, are underlain by very ice-filled permafrost. So not all permafrost has ice. It sounds, I think, sounds sort of oxymoronic. You think permafrost, you think probably ice is there, but no, a lot of permafrost is solid frozen rock, solid frozen sand, etc. It is the ice-filled permafrost that you see in this left-hand map. This is the most susceptible to the thawing. And these are the areas that are falling in, and they happen to be, this is this 6 area here. These are the Vilui regions where I've done my research, where there's one enclave of Saha horse and cattle breeding peoples, and then the central regions is the other area where their ancestors settled and where to this day Saha are working. You see, this is in the central area. This is a thermokarst development here. You see that little van there and the people standing here. This 10 years ago was a completely flat field. Here also we see how the areas are opening up, literally holes in the ground. This is an aerial shot. Alexander Fyodorov shows this often to explain to people, like in Alexei's field site, the people here don't want to go anywhere. They want to stay here. Just like Alexei's communities, they've been here for centuries. Their entire heritage, their history, their cultural lineage is embedded, intertwined in these landscapes. So he shows this as an example when people ask how they can protect their areas. And he talks about this red roofed yard here. And he says the people here, every time it snows in the winter, they shovel all the snow out of their yard because the snow is an insulator. And if they can get rid of all that snow, and that's a lot of work because it snows a lot. But if they can get rid of all that snow, they can keep the underlain permafrost frozen because it's exposed to that frigid cold temperature. But anyone can look at this image and realize that it is not going to last forever. There is this progression, these thermokarst areas are progressing, and it's kind of like you've got something rolling in one direction, it's hard to turn it back. He also, and this kind of also speaks to the dedication that people have to their specific homeland. This is the Chirupchi region, which is in the central area of Saha Yakutia. And Alexander Fyodorov found this, it's a geological, shows the geological structure. So all of this tan area here, these are the Alas ecosystems. These are the areas that have the permafrost that's very ice filled. It's where everybody is right now. This is where those plentiful hay fields are for the animals, etc. And this is bedrock over here. So Alexander Fyodorov went to Chirupchi to, I think, to one of these Talon or one of these villages that are nearby the bedrock area. And he put together this entire plan for them to, start by having 5 or 10 young families go move on to these bedrock areas to start their farming practices there. And then, because gradually all of these Alas areas are going to not be usable because of the permafrost degradation. So he went to all this trouble to put together this plan. And what did they say? They said, well, thank you very much. We'll keep that in mind if we need to do that in the future, but right now we're not going to go anywhere. So he felt a little sad about putting all that energy into it, but it does speak a lot to what Alexei was also saying, is that people are very much attached to place, and it's something that maybe we in the Western consumer world, if you can think of it that way, who maybe have moved a few times in our lifetimes to different places, we don't understand that deep connection to place as these communities that we're working with and talking about in these areas do. So let me go back here for a second before I go to that slide. So for my Fulbright Arctic Initiative proposal, we do work within a larger group of the scholars who are involved in the initiative. I'm in the security group because I'm very interested in how we can bring environmental security more upfront in our conversations globally about security in the Arctic. I think environmental security is critical, and it's got to be talked about and acted upon. But we also have a research aspect to this Arctic initiative. So my proposal, I plan to go back and try to do some sort of an exchange. So obviously our knowledge exchange process, working with communities. We've also done some knowledge exchanges, Alexander Fyodorov and I, in the central regions with communities there, as we had done in the previous slides that I showed you. But I discovered a study in the Yukon in the Northwest Territories of Canada that I contacted Fabrice Calmels, who is the lead on this study, and talked about the possibility of exchanging experiences and understandings. They are working with Aboriginal communities in Canada who are also, as you can see, as you can see in this right-hand picture, also having similar problems with thermokarst development so what they've done is they've done a mapping program where they're working with the local communities to work with them on mapping their hunting areas, the areas that they depend on the most for their hunting and their fishing. And then they bring in their permafrost knowledge and understanding to overlay that, as you can see here, to create a map for communities to understand what areas of the landscape that they use for their hunting and fishing, et cetera, are most vulnerable to the permafrost degradation, medium vulnerability, no vulnerability. They also have created an amazing website for community use where they bring in their stories and their understandings of the landscapes. I'm looking forward to learning more about what their efforts are in our exchange. I plan to go this summer. That's not going to happen because of COVID. Hopefully I'll get there next summer. So one of the other things I just wanted to mention quickly is this, just a little bit more of a understanding of what I'm talking about when I talk about knowledge systems. I was involved in one of the IPCC special reports on SROCC, which is Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. It came out 2 years ago, and it focused on those issues of the changing cryosphere and the changing ocean, et cetera. I was involved in chapter 1, which framed the rest of the report. And my main focus was to develop the framework for bringing in Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge into the IPCC process. So IPCC, of course, began in the early 90s. They're working on the 6th assessment report at this point in time. All along, very heavy scientific knowledge, as Joel was talking earlier, a lot of measuring, a lot of gauging, a lot of modeling, a lot of projecting, but not a lot of the human aspect of climate change. So in our process, what we're trying to bring forth is the importance of not just a scientific understanding, but of a local community-based understanding. If they are indigenous communities, they have an indigenous knowledge system. If they're local communities, you and I, we use local knowledge all the time to get around in our daily lives, etc. So it's a way of bringing this to policymakers so they understand it. Now, this is the visual we made for the report. If any of you have ever been involved in making a visual representation of what you're trying to put across in words, it's a big challenge. But we didn't want to say that local knowledge and indigenous knowledge are just complementing scientific knowledge. We want to give each of these knowledge systems their rightful place, because they have a rightful place, obviously, in the human society. The vertical axis that you see, trajectory of knowledge systems over time, we wanted to communicate the fact that these are not knowledge systems that are frozen in time, but they're constantly evolving. And we also wanted to give a sense that these knowledge systems can come together and provide a more in-depth and more detailed picture of what is taking place. And so the kinds of questions that we're asking in our group, our security group, and I'm not sure, are these showing up with okay. So the kinds of questions that we're asking, we had our security group meeting yesterday, and some of the ideas we had, because we saw similar threads through all of our interests in terms of how do we make security more of a bottom-up process? How do we make it so that it actually takes into consideration the issues on the ground for the local communities? And so the question, of course, is how do we make these knowledge systems as accessible as the scientific knowledge is? And how do we essentially do what we did with the knowledge exchanges, make them so that they are understandable at all levels? Both policymakers can understand, and like Alexei was showing us through his research, how can we communicate what he so well communicated to us? How can we actually get policymakers to understand that there are people out there and they want to stay in those places, and this is important, and they can't just move, and we can't just write off the coast of Chukotka and say, well, I guess it's just going to dissolve into the ocean and that'll be that, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, these are important questions. So those are some of the ideas we have so far. Of course, we're only a few months into the Arctic Initiative process. So that's my presentation, and just to acknowledge a little bit about that. These are Saha horses who live outside all year round. They're also having issues like the reindeer in Chukotka with the ice cover and being able to access. Yeah, okay, I will stop sharing.
Well, that was wonderful. I think I'm a little bit overwhelmed thinking about everything that's been presented today, and it's going to take me a little while to absorb all this. But I think it's really, I just think it put things really quite viscerally to anyone who's interested in the Arctic and the effect it has, the climate change has on communities. So I think that this is just an inflection point in what I hope will be a continuing conversation, and that we'll continue using this medium to present and discuss, and to hopefully make a change that's positive for the people who live in the places you described. Ksenia, did you have anything you'd like to say as we close the session?
I'll probably echo your sentiment, and I think you and I both came up with similar ideas about follow-up events and relative events that we could organize based from this session and from the Arctic seminar. There's a lot to talk about, to communicate, and it's great that we have such experts who can represent the people, the local people of those communities affected by the climate change, and who can be the voice, you know, to make them make their concerns heard. So it's great that we had this opportunity with the American Center as well as the Arctic Seminar. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to our next event that will follow up on this. And I don't think we probably don't have any questions from the audience, since there are none. Yeah, I don't.
I'd like to ask a
Yeah,
question.
sure. Alexei, go ahead.
Yeah, Sьюзан, thank you very much for quite impressive presentation. Such as slides with permafrost degradation, they're very, very interesting to me as for permafrost researcher. And especially vulnerability maps on permafrost in Canada. I'm about to publish my work where I also identify the areas vulnerable to climate change and more stable. And this is quite interesting direction of study. And my question is, I saw pictures of different pupils, like children on your study. Do you plan to involve schools, to involve children in your studies, since they have a more flexible mind and they can be turned into leaders who can be voice of local communities, and to teach them, to show them what happens with their communities in order to make an impact on this opinion?
That's a great question. And actually, after the knowledge exchanges, which were in 2010, Alexander Fyodorov, he had not set up a permafrost gauge in the Suntar region, which is where my research is. And he wanted to, and so we set it up in one of my research villages, and we created a school focus for it. We called what does the permafrost tell us? So we had the students go out and take the measurements every week, measuring the temperature of the permafrost, and the whole idea was for them to extrapolate. So how does the change in that permafrost actually affect our life above ground? That kind of thing. I think they're continuing to keep that course going. And the handbooks that we created are used in the schools. We were able to publish 3,000 copies of them. We published them in Yakutsk at the Bichik Publishing House, and the Ministry of Ecology was generous enough to distribute them throughout the Vilui regions to all the schools, the administrations, the libraries, and the local environmental representative, whatever they're called, ministry, whatever, yeah. But no, I think it's critical to educate young people about it. So, yeah. How about you? Do you have plans for that?
Yeah, I actually have. I have local lectures in local schools, and we had a program like when we're drilling permafrost in every school and put their data loggers and ask local teachers to have students like a team and measure this temperature in these loggers and to use this data for their local investigations and to apply for different contests of school works, etc., in order to make them to understand that the temperature of permafrost is such a variable which affect the communities, affect the buildings, and we have a educational aspect in our study as well.
Well, that sounds just like what we were doing. But you know what happened after a few years? They stopped doing it, and I asked why, and they said because the region, the Alus, or the Suntar region, they decided that they need to focus on math and science, math and business studies for the young people. There's no time for these kinds of environmental issue type focuses, which of course is very sad. You and I know that for sure.
Yes, this is ridiculous actually, because the math is not such important as their environment around their houses.
Agreed.
I would just comment. I think that there would be a way to integrate those things, math and science, and then some sort of a new political economy of development, of sustainable development for those communities. I think that's very possible. And, you know, it's encouraging to hear, I don't have US cases to compare, but it sounds to me like the Russian way of having contests and grants and things maybe points a positive way forward. That is a way for, you know, in the States we're talking about this idea of a universal basic income. And I think that something like that, along with maybe in combination with what you've described, might be a way forward, because you can't just move those huge numbers of people. They have their attachment and culture that makes them want to remain. Maybe something that could be done that would enable that in a way that's psychologically sustainable or adjustable for all the changes that will continue to go on due to climate change. But it would be so interesting to find more ways to compare best practices across communities, so people would have more tools and ways to respond to climate change.
Yeah, and the other
conversation is a big step forward. Go ahead, please, by all means.
I know, I was just going to say the other important part of these rural communities is that they actually are, they're locuses of biocultural diversity. As soon as people move to urban centers, they tend to lose their language. They start assuming the dominant language. And I don't know the extent to which the people that you interacted with, Alexei, still know their Chukchi language, but I'm sure you spoke Russian with them, but I don't know the extent to which they maintain their native language or not, but it's a huge issue in terms of cultural perpetuation. As soon as a person loses their language, in the Arctic Social Indicators project that I worked with, language was the main indicator of cultural integrity for a group. As soon as people lose their language, a lot of other aspects of their culture go.
Yeah, I agree. This is a very big problem. If in Chukotka a young man, or just man, is younger than 35 years old, he don't know his native language.
Yeah.
Only elders know local languages like Yupik or Chukchi language. Yeah, this is a very big problem for Chukotka as well.
Yeah, in Saha Republic, I always thought that the Saha language was protected because there's 450,000 Saha. They're a large numbered non-Russian group. But a few years ago, when we were doing our research in the villages, the children, young children, are getting iPhones from their parents as sort of a babysitter, right? And what are they doing? They're watching Russian cartoons. And so these young children go to preschool only speaking Russian. They're Saha children. They live in a Saha community and they refuse to speak Saha. So it's concerning. It's concerning, but that's a whole nother topic, but it's also related. Yeah.
Okay, well, we could go on, but I guess
we could go on
no,
forever.
We can go on forever.
At least there's no commercial break to interrupt us, but so there's nothing like that to be concerned about. But I think I think I just need some time to think all through this and how we can take a next positive step. But again, thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
And thank you so much to the American Center in Moscow. Yeah, this is a nice practice. This is the first time we've joined the live stream. So I hope we'll have an opportunity to do so in the future, especially since we haven't been to the actual American Center for quite some time now. And it's very cozy and I miss it sometimes. So thank you so much, Susan and Alexei. I hope we'll see you again and follow up on your research. And maybe you will join us for our future projects.
Would love to. Thank you for having me.
Thank you
Thank
so
Thank you
much.
very much.